do you wish you were told? On that day when you were first given that little packet of pills, what do you think if they were being completely honest with you and they knew what you know now, what is the sort of the list of things you would have said to a young Sarah about this decision?
To me, the one thing, and then we can kind of dive down into what this all means, but the thing that would have really made a difference to me is that your hormones make you who you are. And when you change your hormones, you change who you are, right? So the birth control pill is going to change you. It changes the version of yourself that your brain creates. And so if you're going to be going on this, you need to understand what that does. So this, of course, begs the question, what does it do? Right. And there are several things that the birth control pill does, right? And there's at least 5 different things that the birth control does to change who we are, right? It changes our sexual desire and who we're attracted to. It changes our emotional states, right? It can affect our moods. It can affect our ability to regulate and to manage stress, right? It influences sexual desire and sexual function. It influences our ability to be able to put on muscle mass and affects our nutrition and fitness goals, right? It affects all of us. And not knowing all of that and not knowing the potential risks of having side effects related to mental health and libido, all the way to everything, to who a person is attracted to, I wish I would have known that. That probably would have, impacted, again, decisions that I would have made about staying on it when I didn't need to, because there's no reason to change who you are if you don't need the contraceptive benefits.
So on that first point then, it changes who you're attracted to, your sexual desire. Mm-hmm. How?
Well, so mechanistically, the way that this happens has everything to do with the hormonal changes that are initiated by the birth control pill. And so just to talk about the mechanics of this first and then talking about the downstream effects of it next, mechanically what goes on when you take hormonal birth control is you are suppressing ovulation. Right. And the way that birth control does this is it does this by giving you a combination of hormones or a single hormone that tells your brain not to stimulate the ovaries and not to ovulate. Right. And it does this by way of a synthetic progesterone called a progestin. And progestins, which are in all forms of hormonal birth control, when they get picked up in the hypothalamus in the brain, that sends a signal that the brain should not stimulate the ovaries and should not lead to egg maturation and egg development. And when this happens, when the brain is not stimulating the ovaries, this means the body is not producing estrogen. Right, so estrogen levels are kept really low, and instead you get this daily dose of a synthetic progesterone or progestin that is supplanting that. Right, many forms of hormonal birth control, in addition to having that synthetic progesterone or progestin that turns off the brain's communication with the ovaries. It also has a relatively low level of estrogen that is also added. So combination hormonal birth control pills contain progestin and a little bit of estrogen, but the estrogen levels are kept really low. And the progesterone levels or the progestin levels are the dominant hormone. And you get that same hormonal message every day. Right? When you do that, what happens when you flatline a woman's own production of hormones and replace them with a daily dose of synthetic progesterone, this does a few things to women's sexual psychology. The first thing that it does is it turns off that estrogen surge that you get right prior to ovulation that's related to a heightened preference for sex. That estrogen surge is related to an increased preference for testosterone markers in mates. Right? It's related to women's interest in sex. It's related to sexual function. All of those things that increase right prior to ovulation that help to promote reproduction, sexual reproduction, all of those things are turned off on women on hormonal birth control because instead they're getting the same daily message in which progestin is the dominant hormonal message and estrogen levels are really low. So that's the first thing that happens.
But they're still horny, right? They're still...
Yes, I mean, they still will have sex and they still want sex, but many women report experiencing a real decrease in their libido when they're on hormonal birth control. That's a very common response. And the reason for this is twofold. One of the things that's a big factor in promoting women's sexual desire and libido is estrogen. And as estrogen is rising in the cycle, because when estrogen is rising, this is a time in the cycle when sex can lead to conception. This is something that's known to fuel the female sexual response. So the women's sexual response and their sexual desire all increases with estrogen levels across the cycle. So when you take hormonal birth control and that's flatlined, which is what it does, this means that sexual desire is kept more constant across the cycle. So you do tend to find that women who are using hormonal birth control tend to have fewer peaks and valleys in sexual desire than naturally cycling women do. But on the whole, it tends to be lower. The other thing that happens on hormonal birth control that can lead to a decrease in libido is that all of those synthetic hormones that are in hormonal birth control, they tend to lead to an increase in what's known as sex hormone binding globulin, which is a real mouthful. But what it does is that this is something that's released by the liver and it binds up free testosterone, right? So it binds up testosterone and makes it inactive in the body. And testosterone, even though we tend to think of it as like a guy thing and like this is a male hormone, it's actually really important in terms of promoting women's sexual desire. And women who are on hormonal birth control have levels of free testosterone that are about 60% lower than that of their naturally cycling peers. And so what this means, again, is that you have another, blow to women's sexual desire when they're on hormonal birth control. Those low levels of estrogen and then really low levels of free testosterone, those two things work together to suppress sexual desire in women. And it can also change attraction because as we noted, when women are approaching, ovulation, their estrogen levels increase. And this is something that research finds to be related to women's interest in testosterone markers in men. Researchers more recently said, if that's true, what happens when you put women on hormonal birth control and estrogen levels are kept really low? And what they find is that lo and behold, women who are using hormonal birth control do seem to have a dampened preference for cues related to masculinity and testosterone in partners relative to what's observed in naturally cycling women.
Which specifically means that a woman on birth control is less likely to be interested in a guy who is what?
A guy who has really masculinized features. So, for example, if you see a face that has high levels of testosterone, generally men will have like more deep set eyes. They tend to have a wider jaw. In the bodies, they tend to have broader shoulders and a more narrow waist. Men with more deep voices, men who have cues to like behavioral cues to social dominance. That's also something related to testosterone. And what the research finds is that women who are using hormonal birth control do prefer a less masculinized male face relative to what is observed in naturally cycling women.
I mean, this is slightly concerning if you're a man, right? Because if my partner's on the pill and then she comes off the pill, she might not like me.
Right. Yeah, no. And that's a real important question. I mean, it's very provocative because what does that mean? And there have been some research studies that have looked at that exact question. And one of the best studies that's looked at this question is one that was a longitudinal study of married couples. They followed women who were using hormonal birth control at the time that they met their partner. And then they just followed them over time to see what would happen when women discontinued the pill. What happened when they discontinued was that there were real significant changes in how attracted women were to their partner, depending on whether they chose them using hormonal birth control. But what was interesting about it is whether the women became more or less attracted to their partner depends on how attractive their partner was. And so what the researchers found is that women who were partnered to attractive men, when they went off hormonal birth control, they were more attracted to their partner and were more sexually attracted to their partner and more sexually satisfied within their relationship relative to where they were beforehand. But for women who were partnered with less attractive partners, they had the opposite effect. So when they went off hormonal birth control, they became less attracted to their partners and reported being less sexually satisfied with their partners than where they were beforehand. And so this suggests that yes, it is a very real possibility that if you have a partner who chose you when you're using hormonal birth control, that this can change attraction within the context of the relationship. But whether that's good or bad probably depends on a bunch of other dimensions that you need to take into effect, including partner's attractiveness.
If you love the Diary of a CEO brand and you watch this channel, please do me a huge favor. Become part of the 15% of the viewers on this channel that have hit the subscribe button. It helps us tremendously, and the bigger the channel gets, the bigger the guests.